It happened like 3 days before Christmas. I was walking to 127th Street Station when I spied a white Ford Explorer at a stop sign. It wasn't going anywhere, so I figured there's no way I'm gonna get hit in the middle of Harlem. The next thing I remember, feel the front grille smashed into my rib. Classic hit and run. But I ran into the person driving that car almost 2 years to the day, and that is when things get interesting. So, a little background about what happened. Believe it or not, this was not my first. The previous accident, I was also struck on the left side of my body. So, the hit and run essentially aggravated injuries, both physical and in a lot of ways, more so emotional. I had a pretty morbid fear of crossing intersections. My hands would start to sweat, feeling my heartbeat accelerate, breathing would start to get labored. This happened for the entire period leading up to the hit and run. On that particular day, I approached what was an intersection with a stop sign. Stood there, waited for it to go. It just was not moving. There's this tug of war in my head whereby one side of me is telling me, don't go, don't go, don't go, it's gonna happen again. Don't go, don't go, it's gonna happen again. Trying to reassure myself, overcoming my fear, like the sudden surge of a panic attack, I start crossing the street. The moment I hear the engine rev, this thought runs through my mind, not again. And I just felt the impact, like it was instantaneous. Literally the next thing I remember is just waking up on the pavement. My suit was torn, there were scrape signs on my hands. Everything I was holding was sort of like strewn all over the street. First thing I thought was, how could this happen to me again? The pain was just like beginning to overwhelm all other sensations. But what was more frustrating for me, like they had planned for me to be there and take me out. I couldn't think of anyone that would want to do that. Well, at the time anyway. But I was sort of beginning to become obsessed with finding out who it was that did this to me. It became sort of like, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just wanted to see the person and confront them. A little over a year and a half, almost 2 years later, I was working in Midtown Manhattan. And some people remember this. I used to have dreads. And I was walking back from lunch, tapped on the shoulder, and I turned around. It was a slightly disheveled woman, probably a few inches shorter than me. She kind of had an unsavory smell. She just had a strange demeanor. Looked at me in the eye after I turned around. Do you have a moment? I'd like to ask you something. And I said, sure. What is this? I'm probably not gonna believe her, but she believes that she may have been involved in an accident in which she struck me with her car. And the moment she says that, I feel a sense of anxiety about what's going on, whether I'm getting played. She continues. She said she had had a lot of trouble. She was in danger of losing her job. Her marriage was falling apart, almost going to be evicted from her apartment. And she remembers pulling up to a stop, checking her phone. Without looking up, she started driving. She heard this loud boom. She looked out and she saw this young man lay out on the floor. She just panicked and just drove off, just afraid to have more problems. So many things that were going on in her life that when I just stared at her and I didn't say anything. She then continued that despite what she did, she ended up losing her job. Her husband divorced her, wound up being evicted from her apartment, and she was currently homeless. But despite everything that she'd gone through, the guilt of having potentially killed somebody was the worst thing that she'd felt. She ultimately felt that she deserved everything that happened to her because of what she'd done. A couple of days prior, she had noticed me in the area and she wasn't sure whether it was the same person. She wanted to be sure. She recognized that I had dreads, I was wearing a suit, I was sharply dressed. Started crying she hopes I can forgive her for what she'd done. I just smiled and I gave her a hug and I said, of course, I've already forgiven you. And I had. It wasn't even a second thought. I realized that I had forgiven her long before that. I understood forgiveness is an individual choice. During the period when I was recovering from the accident, going through that internal process that was sort of fraught with rage and frustration over not just the pain I was experiencing, but the injustice of having been subjected to that pain, I would read from a variety of sources, theological, philosophical, spiritual, to get a sense for how to process these emotions and how to process what I was thinking. The predominant theory of forgiveness that I was exposed to growing up was a biblical one. Several passages in the Bible that speak on the subject. But the thing that I struggled with in these passages, God plays this sort of the role of something of an arbiter between the person that is wronged and the wrongdoer, such that the person who's been wronged has to deal with the fact that if they're unable to forgive the wrongdoer in some ways, because we're all sinners, right? God will not forgive you for your sins. So there's this interrelationship between not just you as the person wronged and the person doing the wrong, but God as this objective third party, which has some salience. For me, what I was struggling with was that when I also started doubting my faith, you don't have a belief that God is this third arbiter. So during this process, I ran into an article by Jacques Couenhoven called Forgiveness and Restoration, in which he said that forgiveness addresses an injury that can happen to good people, attacks on their intrinsic human dignity. What I loved about this passage, the sense that an injury for which forgiveness is necessary affects your basic human dignity. It's an attack on your sense of personhood. Really resonated with what I was feeling. I sort of started thinking, how can I conceive of a way to deal with what's happened to me? And one particular quote from French philosopher Jacques Derrida honed this understanding of forgiveness for me as an individual choice. Derrida's definition of forgiveness is one that is devoid of the transactional component with the other. It doesn't matter what the wrongdoer says or does to you or for you. Ultimately, your capacity to overcome that harm is an internally driven decision that for some people and for some actions can never happen, right? Some things potentially that can never be forgiven. That's very subjectively driven. That's sort of dependent on the person and the situation. It's, again, a reflection of the fact that it's a decision that's based on the person who's been wronged and their capacity to just accept and decide and determine that they have relinquished whatever negativity they bear towards the wrongdoer and then to just move forward. There's this distinction between forgiving and reconciling. You don't need the other person to forgive. The moment that you're able to let go and to relieve yourself of this burden that you're carrying, that's what happened to me. I just got to the point where I just let go. I feel blessed and relieved that I'm alive at all, given that this was my second accident. More on that later. I had the capacity to let go of the outcome of that action. It was an individualized, specific circumstance that defined me in many ways, but was not going to be the only defining element of that experience. So I let go. It was fascinating that I happened to run into the person that did that to me, and she asked for my forgiveness. Had I not gone through that process, I would never have been in the space to not just tell her that I forgave her, but wholeheartedly embrace her and try to alleviate her of the pain that she experienced for what happened. By saying I forgive you, I simultaneously reinforced my sense of liberation from that negativity. I was able to bring to her any measure of relief and satisfaction for what she'd been through. And in this sense that one can see that the person who's been harmed and wronged can harness their capacity to forgive to alleviate the suffering of the person who is doing the wrongdoing. One of the many interesting experiences I had in the streets of New York.